also, or are we going to just see a picture? What's going to happen?
I'm traveling, so I just realized that I have not set the settings on my iPad so you can see me. Otherwise, I'm going to have to use my phone.
Mm-hmm.
So that if you give me a few seconds, let me just
Enough time.
see if I can access it here. You seem to be very busy with all these interviews.
Look, this topic is so close to my heart that I really like these discussions, because I want these discussions to be out there, which is, I feel, got missed out in the whole, like I was just talking to Chuck also, on the whole institutionalized mediation. I think this aspect did not get highlighted. That's the way I look at it. But when you click on the camera, it doesn't say that you allow the camera or something like that.
I need to allow the camera, yeah. I need to allow.
But what, you're driving from Myanmar to?
No, I live in the south of Thailand now. And so I travel frequently up to the north and Myanmar, and also still to the Middle East.
Well, I sent you a message about what country or countries I should write against your name, but of course I didn't get a reply, so I put South Africa there. I don't know whether that was right or not.
South Africa is good. Yeah, no, I'm happy to be South Africa. You know, it's I guess nowadays you don't always, nobody know where we're from when we're in these meetings. It's
I like to highlight it only from this thing that, okay, the person is bringing an experience from that country, and sometimes people have this concept of stereotypes about countries, and they should see, no, maybe you've been looking at people from a certain country from a certain level, but there are bringing these thoughts also. So that's the only reason for I put out. So if there are more than one country, I'm more than happy to put them out.
Yeah, no, I think our countries do.
Yeah. Because what I tell people is, look, if you're a citizen of a country, we can put the citizenship. If you're a resident, a permanent resident of a country, let's put that also. So at least that wider exposure that you have has some value. So that comes in. But anyway, Hans, thank you very much for doing this. Your experience that you have is going to be really useful to bring out where heart, soul, spirituality can be brought in for the kind of work that you are doing. Hans is just coming in. Yes, Hans, now you're connected.
Okay, so you can see me now?
Yep. It's always nice to see the person.
Yeah. So I've listened to several of your other discussions. It was really wonderful to listen to each one of them. It was very...
people have actually brought out some interesting aspects. Very interesting aspects have been brought out.
That's great.
So the important thing is, thank you very much for doing this.
Yeah.
And of course, you're going to tell us as much as you can tell us about yourself, because that connection, like I've been saying, is important to bring in where that heart, soul, spirituality aspect is coming from. So as much backwards in time as you want to, present, everything, please.
Well, as you already mentioned, I'm from I was born in South Africa, and ancestors coming from various parts of the world. But you know, so and that was something I was very conscious of. I think the South African experience was quite fascinating. I think you know, I guess you know, the experience of people like Gandhi made a big impact on many of us when we were younger. I only discovered much, you know, only after I went to university, I discovered Gandhi is not South African, he's Indian, you know, because of, you know, we only saw Gandhi with the past laws and what he's done, you know, setting these things alight and his courage. And so it was for many of us, he was one amongst also many of our own leaders that were inspirations to us, you know. But yeah, so I grew up also in a Dutch Reform minister's house. I will call it a priest's house. And my father was a minister to in many of the villages and towns that he lived. He was ministers to the, you know, at that point we had the churches, colored, white and black, all different. So he often was the minister of all three. So it was often, you know, at a spiritual level, it was very fascinating to me learning. I remember there was a wonderful, you know, he's living in the white church house, and one Sunday there was a crisis in the colored church, and he invited them all to come, and you know, the house was filled just after the church in the white church was obviously white people. And he invited them all in because they were all senior leaders and teachers and school principal and the minister on the other side. And I guess it was my first very serious political experience, and seeing the mixture between politics, spirituality, and religion, you know, where you really have the same church, but it is three religions. You know, practicing three very different sets of theology and values, and then come, you know, at the essence of what is the spirituality that drives the dealing with the broken relationships. And I guess for me was, you know, really fascinating to see how each one articulated that brokenness, you know, and how they dealt with that brokenness and where they stood in that. I later on also studied for 5 years to be a Dutch Reform minister. I was less successful. I remember my 5th year, after taking 6 months off and walk around the South African beaches to find my spiritual life, my old professor on one of my hitchhikes, long stretch, I saw his car pass me and he stopped very far. And when I arrived at the car, he said, "Siebert, did you find yourself?" And you know, I got in and didn't say much. But eventually, you know, I left after 5 years. I was sort of gently asked not to continue because of the political involvement. But, you know, and that's where I think I became a railway worker for 2 years. And that was, you know, another meeting point of spirituality, politics, and shedding some of the dogma of religion that really, you know, as our own cultural ways of finding paths to a spiritual being that we then frame within dogma. You know, and I think religion often, you know, whether it's very little to do with God, but more our own perception of a deity or dogma that we think make us pure or moral or get us onto a moral high ground. But anyway, so my journey started there, but then after 2 years, the police drove over me for revealing some of the killings that took place in the railways, and I ended up for 2 years in hospital, which was a really fascinating spiritual journey in the beginning. And after that, when I got out, I became a journalist for 8 years and a newspaper editor. And it was when our South African peace process started that I went back to peace work. I mean, even through journalism, it was always for me, how do we find between the covers of a magazine or the front and back page of a newspaper or on a radio program, how do we find people to be able, how do we find ways where that people can meet and really hear each other and listen to each other? And I guess that remained a big motivation. And when the South African peace structure started in early 90s, I was asked to join that. And that was sort of my journey to mediation and facilitation, or shall I say, walking journeys with those that are trying to find change, where it include everybody in their country, in their communities, and it was quite an experience. Obviously, in the South African situation, most of my adult life was in the liberation movement up to then. But in the conflict resolution, it was very difficult in a national context where you have your own values and political views, and then you become a facilitator and work in a peace process. And how do you work with those that have killed your friends or hunted you down? So it was a really difficult scenario, but really liberating also. There's a Indian professor in South Thailand that always he really impressed me every time I listened to him in the south of Thailand, where he said, I am unequivocally biased. And as a mediator and facilitator, my biggest job is to manage my biasness and to find a way on how to do that. And it, later on, it connected to me with something that Archbishop Tutu's always said, that if you are standing on the side, of the oppressor, if you are neutral in the context of oppression, you have taken the side of the oppressor, and that's more in a theological level, but that did, the same way I had many questions about religion. It also, at least the religion we were taught, it also questioned many of the dogma of mediation, because I think mediation has become a dogma. Conflict resolution has become, for many, a religious dogma in some ways, in a more, shall we say, anyway, let's leave it there. But so it was the whole thing of objectivity and neutrality is where do we stand? I mean, and that was always connected for me to my own spirituality. That how do we embrace the human beings on the different sides of divides, and meet them in their places of brokenness, and walk journeys with us, with them, acknowledging also our own brokenness. How broken we are, and and where do we find hope in that brokenness, and where do we find a new compass, which is obviously some of it is ours and most of it is theirs. How do one take out the rust and reorientate some of those brokenness in processes? And I remember in Nepal when I was there, I had an image one day sitting with the old facilitators in a meeting and parties from the Maoist and Congress and others. And it was, for me, almost like a huge river, of the divide. And everybody knew they needed to change, but it was, nobody's willing to walk into that river, to cross. I mean, you're familiar with the wonderful book from John Paul Lederach of moral imagination and sort of other things that is written on dignity and hope, finding hope in moments like this. And I guess for me, there was really looking at where do we find and work with parties in moments like that to help them to walk into that unknown. And what is it that helps them to walk into that unknown? Because as you know, and listening to all the stories that you wonderfully captured here is that, for many can't walk into that unknown because of the brokenness and the pain they experience and the distrust and I guess, in each case, like in South Africa, everybody that was anything in mediation came to train us. So by the end of 4 years, we had training from everybody, and so people will say, so who do you follow? And who, you don't know who you follow where your heart goes and what makes sense in a specific thing. And later on through the years, you obviously study more and learn more. And then there's a lot of things we need to unlearn, from this field, where, and that's where when you contacted me to participate here, I was particularly intrigued in your heading, because this is something for me, a very key thing, the interaction between spirituality, our values, and mediation, facilitation. You can't disconnect these. They are so deeply connected. And, particularly when you're in a war, I've had the sad privilege for the last 20 years to be in several wars. And, because I think we are fundamentally instruments of hope, of how do we bring hope into a situation, even if we don't open our mouths, even if we are just there with those that are struggling, with those that are trying to find a way through, because I think very often we don't have to say anything. Very often we just need to be there and listen and quietly, when the time is right, to share something which many of them already know, So I think that is for me sort of, people often say, oh, things is positive enough, there's hope. I say, well, hope is not hope when it's positive. Then it's not hope, then it's positivity. Hope is when there is no sign of hope, when there is nothing. And you have to find those things that, which is beyond what we see and beyond what we hear and beyond the deaths of every day. In Syria, there was a time where there were 11,000 people dying per month. In Myanmar, we see villages being burned down every week now for a year. And we see so many people arrested and being killed. And we're working with each of these leaders, and it is, walking with them and seeing them find hope is a humbling experience, because they can't wake up and not be there, and that is really quite a process. I mean, in my work since the South African peace process, where it was mostly structural work like peace secretariats and dialogue structures, continue to be very much that in terms of working with parties and people in the country to reflect with them on the ceasefires or help with the drafting of peace structures or peace agreements or ceasefire agreements, and then the design of inclusive dialogue processes. And I guess for each one, these are more structural and systemic processes. But with the years, it also, become more than just political instruments, because, these, I prefer to compare them to like white spaces. The white sound we hear is actually not a sound, so, or the white space you see in art. I mean, it doesn't exist. I mean, it is made up of all the other pieces, and I guess for me, in many of these processes, because as probably your experience too is, I think we learn more from what go wrong than what go right. I mean, what go right gives us a very often too much confidence, and what goes wrong makes us humble and continue to search, and what goes wrong often is what we don't see, and when we, it's like that. I think as a facilitator and mediator, is that you become a perpetual student and a perpetual searching for modes of diagnostics, of where is it where things are wrong, and not jumping too quickly into using our normative frameworks to identify, okay, this is what's wrong, because we, those give us a lot of comfort, that give us a lot of confidence. And in the world today, the international donor community or the UN or they all want to know what are these change frameworks and where are the deliverables and all these things. And very often it is not there. I mean, we can write these beautiful reports, but they all sound the same. It very often go beyond that. And that's sort of, for me, the white space thing of, what is it that form that white space? Whether it is relationships or brokenness or culture or religion or values, or, where are our communication, and when all the things that we get taught in religion, in conflict resolution or psychology or our change theories. But if we take them into these white spaces, how do they frame the white spaces, and how do we as facilitators or mediators work with the parties to help see the outlines of those white spaces, that we can start create a framework for the white space, and how do we deal what's in the white space, and within their context and within what is them, not is what is us, but what is who are they in that white space, and I guess that was that remained for me a very over this journey a very useful reflection that brings together deeper levels of spirituality, beliefs, values, brokenness, our own incompleteness, and also what lies between us and the other one, and our own perceptions and perceptions of the others. Yeah, maybe I stop here. I mean, if you have some questions, and we can go deeper into some. I mean, as you publish, I worked in South Africa, Balkans, and Sri Lanka, Nepal, Lebanon, Syria, Cyprus, now in Myanmar, mostly for long periods, from 7 to 10 to 12 years at a time, working with the parties through their change processes. Because I think most of the time we become useful after about 3 years, where we really understand the compass of each one. Where are they? And in so many countries you find yourself, you wonder, what on earth are we doing here? I remember landing in Lebanon at the invitation of the president. We're going to design a national dialogue. And when I walked into my office, the guy who was the head of research and later on became the director of the Institute for National Dialogues for the UN in the Middle East, he said, so how is all this fancy mediation and facilitation things of you working? You all came to train us, and he sounded very familiar to South Africans. He said, you all came to train us and none of it works, so please don't teach these things here. We had it enough, as you open your mouth about that. So, you sort of wonder, why am I here? And you question each one of these tools. And I must say, I think it is almost some of these old religious frameworks that they just, people talk about them, but they become so meaningless, that it's empty of the essence of it, and, at one point I remember in Yemen, one of the UN people saying, when we were having a reflection on the Yemen process, they said, so, this context doesn't work for our tools. And yes, that's it. It's a very accurate thing to say. It's showing you how bad our tools are. And if this is the way we're looking at it, I thought our tools are. And that's a big problem, I think, in many of the conflicts we're in, is that people get contracted to come and implement their tools or advise in their tools. And their tools are their sources of confidence, of what they can teach, of what will change. And they are disastrous failures most of the time, and then you wonder, I remember in Myanmar, they spent 3 years with almost 800 people designing the national dialogue process. And when we showed the 5 designs, people were saying, why on earth are you doing this with people and showing them 5 designs? I said, can you imagine I designed any of these things? You must be crazy. I could never design any of these things. These are much more complicated than anything that could come out of my head. I mean, in terms of understanding of their context and their dynamics. And I guess, sometimes we need to let go. If we are based in the compass of our own spirituality and values, that is open, and where our compass in these situations are always drawn on the poles of those that are in there, and also their understanding of why they are going there, and that they are our compass also. Then one, I guess, then it's often good to let go, but still an enormous responsibility of walking with those and finding hope every day. So let me stop here.
Well, I think that's very interesting. I just wanted to listen because whatever you're saying, all these things is what of course, the thought comes from all these things, and this is what I need to highlight. These are things that need to be highlighted. I had last symposium, I had Shadia Maraban from Indonesia. He works in Myanmar also, I think. So she works in areas where there is violence, conflicts where there is violence. And she says how these people, whom of course some people call rebels, some will call terrorists or whatever, that people break down, cry in front of her. That's the connection with the heart that is created. So that's what that whole discussion in that symposium was. From there, I said, let's highlight this aspect, because connecting to the heart of someone and to be able to, in areas where you would never think that that would be a way of maybe resolving things, but to be able to do that, I think that's why this needs to be highlighted. The aspect of connectedness, heart, soul, spirituality, whatever that has to be. So, of course, you'll take us through. I put it down into four things now: heart, soul, spirituality in relation to the dispute, the mediator itself, the parties, and the process. So, if you want to throw, I mean, light on each of them separately, that'd be nice.
Um, yeah, I do think, we as facilitators or mediators uh, or people who travel these journeys with people going through these extraordinary conflicts, I think it's very critical, what's going on in our own minds of how do we impact on it. Because I think the fact that they invite us to be part of it, or that they allow us to enter that space of confidence and trust, is a huge responsibility, and what do we do with it? I mean, and I find that still, after all these years, still almost those sacred moments of, when you reflect on that, of where people are. I mean, at a personal level, on a spiritual level, I remember where, before I left church in the mid-90s, my father and the professor had many conversations of, how could this God preaching allow so many people to go to hell if this is a God of love and created, so-called created everybody. And as one go on, I remember a few years in Myanmar, there was a missionary coming to see me, and he said, I've been in over 40 countries, and I've never been in a village where God was not there before me, and he's mostly working in Asia, and I think, I guess, with God meaning people that have a spiritual centeredness, in a connection to their own spirituality and that of others and that of around them, and something bigger than themselves. And I guess that was for me a very huge element of, that how do we search for the spirituality in each of the people we work with? It takes some quietness and meditation and prayer, and it also take time spending with them, of digging deeper into where they really are, and how consistent, or how does their political views manifest in personal values, or how their personal values manifest in political views, or how does that, where's the source of their strength in moments like that? And it's always good to, it's not good, but it is revealing to see people in the middle of a war, to see what's their sources of strength, and see, really, I mean, I just see the extraordinary, touching the extraordinary moments of human life, what in the middle of an existential situation of war, where you see that beauty of a human spirit coming out, which you don't see around the dialogue table all the time. I mean, that is, and I mean, sometimes you do with people that surprise you, that would that you see over time they've broken down their own hurt and their own prejudice, and that they are able to reach out to the others. And I never forget my first meeting with the commander-in-chief of the Nepal army was when they reached an agreement. People were not sure he really took it seriously. And he was the stepson of the king, and very known to be a very vicious and hard general. And I'm deaf in both of my ears, so I have hearing aids in both of my ears after my South African accident. So I went in there, and the Maoist leaders and some of the democratic leaders asked me to meet with him. I did. He was a tough man, and I was petrified. Eventually he see I'm fiddling with my ear, but it was very hot. So when it get hot, your hearing aids make a noise when sweat inside your ears. And he saw I touching these things, and he saw the listening devices. So I explained to him I'm deaf, and he said, "No, take them out." I had to put them on the table in front of him. He kept talking, and in that moment, I was quite humiliated. I must have shown that I got angry. I'm not a person that easily get angry. Certainly not with people like him. But I was quite upset for some reason, and I eventually stopped him and I said, "General, I can't hear. I mean, why you keep talking? I can't hear. If you want a conversation with me, I need to put these things back in my ear." He said, "Can't you open and see for yourself? Put them in your own ears and see." And he eventually gave them back to me, and we had the conversation. And he told me the story of he was an orphan, and how the old king adopted him, and that's why he was the stepson of the current king, stepbrother. And that moment of him seeing my vulnerability allowed him to open up his vulnerability and telling me a story. And we had a connection throughout the time I was in Nepal. I mean, he would still shout at me when he see me often, but it was there was a connection that went beyond the political. It was a connection beyond the harsh things that divided people. And it's so often that we find these in our vulnerabilities of the parties and of the people, particularly with the people that there's just that little thing that you touch with also making yourself vulnerable, and that they see how you deal with your own vulnerability. I don't think I particularly dealt with my vulnerability very well that day, but it was fascinating that it gave him that opportunity. But I've seen that subsequently in many situations, how that vulnerability in ourselves open up or allow people to open up. Because I think as our skills of a mediator, I think those are given. Those are not things that we, those are essential skills that you keep within your professional realm. I think what for me your topic look at is how do we look at that skills beyond that skills within the framework of human spirituality and what drives them, whether they are religious nationalists or they are fanatics or radicals, or each one of them, those things play a very crucial role. And I felt also, I think life has very gracious that every conflict we get involved in, the previous one prepared us for the next one, and the previous ones prepared us for the next ones in terms of our own preparedness as mediators and facilitators of how deep we can do that journey with each of the parties. I was quite sometimes I still am, quite a systemic follower, a very strong one in terms of, designing processes with parties in a very systemic way. And that does give us ways to deal with it. But there's also ways that you've got to, where the limitations of that is very big, and that one need to look beyond that. And I remember when the Syrian conflict was in its third year, I think, and none of the ceasefires worked, and everybody tried to do ceasefires, and we had several Syrians arriving at our office in Beirut, really remarkable people. And as we reflected with them for days, it turned out they were every year, in that period, up to 80 small ceasefires. And it's a failed process, but there are 80 small ceasefires. And each one of those ceasefires were negotiated by people, people that have the courage to do that. And that was so revealing of, starting to identify in Syria who are the peace assets, people, organizations, processes, and let that reality be the instruments of how you design and, they jointly design a new peace process, and it was such a revelation. They did that for a long time. And there were only over 20,000 networks involved, organizations involved in the network. And it was one of the most inspiring things, and none of it was our creation. None of it was a mediator or a facilitator or the UN or an international agency's efforts. And that, that's my other point I would like to make, that I think in every village there's a peacemaker. And I think that's, if we forget that, that is a problem, because those people are there, and they deeply carry the essence of that community and understand it, and they are compassionate, and many times it's not articulated. The old facilitators in Nepal, and you have in Asia in the Middle East, you have the Mokhtars, and in Asia, what is that conflict resolution mechanism, the traditional one, where the elders sit and people come and talk. And people criticize them severely because it's either arbitration or a bad form of mediation. And I kept saying, how do we strengthen these things rather than just dismiss them and replace them with a mediator? Because this is the anatomy of a society. It has grown slowly, and just how do one strengthen it from inside and move it? And that's, I think, in larger peace processes like the Myanmar one or the Lebanon one or the Syria one, is really, how do you find those peacemakers inside, and you walk with them and you support them, and they are the ones who drive, because they know the parties best and they know the dynamics. Obviously, they've been hurt by one or other side in a conflict, or they've been perceived by one or other side in a different way, and that's often where we gently play a role of supporting them, or complementing them in processes like that, where you either become a punch bag, additional punch bag, or you you play a role of the consciousness of what the other side not able to share, or what they're not able to hear, or of help generate spaces for creativity, where they can think outside of what they've been used to think in terms of their own options on how to resolve a conflict. And I guess that is a very critical part for me in the whole the work we do as mediators in national dialogues or peace agreements or in ceasefires or just rebuilding communities, is that spaces of creativity, and how do we inspire that creative thinking, collective creative thinking, where people have the courage to go on. Let me check in with you where you want to move, put more focus on, because I can jump around badly.
No, I'm really enjoying this, and I'm telling you, and this, what you just said about these people in the village, I think that's for me the focus area now, and how we can bring them out, and then of course society valuing them, how much time that takes, whether they understand, but at least let's have these people out there so that people can relate to them, and also see these aspects which are beyond. For me, I'm very clear, there is that power play politics of definitely happen, but people do understand this aspect of these people, but I think those people have got lost in the background somewhere, so we have to bring them out, and I think that's going to change things. So what you're saying is exactly what we need to put out there, that first of all you're saying and you've experienced that these people exist. People might think that these people don't exist anymore, but they exist. But how to strengthen it? This James Mangarere in Kenya, he's doing some work in terms of strengthening the traditional communities, and of course, like you said, the mediation, arbitration, what is it actually? But he's sensitizing those people, whoever the leaders of the tribe or whatever, to look at it as mediation, how he can do that. So have a look at his session in the last symposium. So he's doing it. He's doing interesting work there. I don't know whether you've seen that work he's doing, but I found that very interesting. So, I'm not going to give you any direction, Hans. I'm really enjoying it. This is exactly what is required. A thought which is not in the direction that, of course, at all. I don't really would like to put in direction to anything that I put out, because there's so many thoughts out there which need to be brought out. So please take it the way you want to. But please, these words of wisdom, these experiences that you've got, we need all that from you.
Well, I maybe just touch on something that I think we're coming in the last 10, 15 years out of periods where national dialogues became, or 20 years, where national dialogues became much more powerful and as instruments for change, where the people themselves create self-mediation mechanisms for change. We had the Nepal process, very typically like that. There was no foreign mediator. Lebanon, the same. And in Myanmar, the same. Outside organizations will often say we are the ones who play that role. No, they were not the ones who play that role. Those people were the ones. The same with South Africa. Many were wonderful catalysts and helped to open options and possibilities and help people to see each other differently. But the catalyst for change were the people themselves. And so I think there was a lot of effort that we put into the open design of national dialogue, so instruments of political change in these countries. I was there when the Tunisians received the Nobel Prize for their national dialogue, and it's just extraordinary to hear what people have done. Really wonderful work in that. But a lot of those dialogues also, the element that was often forgotten, which is now coming to the front, where you see massive people's movements, whether it's in Chile or in Myanmar or in Lebanon or in Russia itself or in Ukraine, where you have huge people's movements, and I found the connection between your people's movements and your formal political change instruments really fascinating. In measuring the people's resolve, the collective hopes and aspirations of the people, and then see how that translates into political positions that then get negotiated around the table. And because many of the people's movements are raw needs and pain and resistance to what's been done to them. And I don't know if you ever heard of the old facilitator Pakmaratne Tuladar in Sri Lanka. He started the oldest Sri Lanka human rights organization. And I remember when the people's movement started there, or about to start, I've been with them for 2 years at that point, and I thought, I refused to be the facilitator when they were there, and I worked with them, and that was what I was originally invited to be. He came to my hotel one morning and he said, the people's movement started in 3 days, and I want you to leave. And you want me to leave? He said, have I done something wrong? He said, no, you really gotta leave. Can you pack your stuff and we go? And I said, where am I going? He said, we're going to the airport. We're driving to the airport, and it was such a humiliating experience for me of driving with this man who I absolutely respected. He said, if you stay, you are going to try to push us into a dialogue with the king. And knowing you are going to do that. And we want you to leave. Because when you see us in jail and being hit by the police, you are not going to be able to stop yourself. So you've got to go. They bought me a ticket back to Sri Lanka, where I was before. And he said, once we're ready, we will call you. It was an awful time, to watch them suffer, see them all arrested, and what is happening. And, on the Friday night before the king abducted, gave up, India tried to intervene, and they rejected India's proposal. And late that Friday night, the old facilitator called me out of jail on a satellite phone and said, can you be here tomorrow morning? And we have a paper for you to go and give to the king. And you follow blindly because you have nothing. You had nothing to do with the process. You have nothing to do with anything. You are just a messenger, and you go there as a sort of trusted messenger. And I fly back and got there, and one of the embassies came to pick me up at the airport. We went to pick up the paper, and we drive to the government buildings where we saw the chief minister, and I went there with the head of the peace secretariat, we know nothing what's in the paper, except what they told us what we need to say, and we gave him this, and he read it in front of us, and he went quiet for a long time, and then he stood up, and when we walk out, the peace secretariat, the head of the peace secretariat, hugged him, and he said, "Peace minister, do the right thing." And 2 days later, the king resigned after many, many centuries. So it was it sometimes, where we as mediators could often stand in the way of real change, because our compulsion is dialogue. Our compulsion is our tools. And what I witnessed in people's movement, you've got to trust the internal political compass. Those that you have confidence in, and that have integrity, that have traveled this journey for a long time, And because they are also responsible, they don't want people to die. They, it's their families, it's their children. And that's a little bit that I've seen here in Myanmar also, where in the last year, since the coup, we saw 3 extraordinary events of days of silence. 3 days of silence that brought the entire country to a standstill. How are you getting people to speak? To speak so you can break this silence, and you can get the country to do something. And it was really extraordinary to see that courage, and I guess with each people's movement, one learn it, or at least you witness it, and it implants into you. It implants into you. You're not going to make that mistake again. You're going to be very careful, and you're going to be very careful of what is the dignified, honorable, honest dialogue, and how do you create spaces for dignified, honorable dialogues that have integrity, that will move forward. Because in many cases, with the frameworks of dialogue and mediation we have, it's based on compromise. It's based on you give in, I give in. In moments like this, in serious wars and conflict, there's not a win-win situation. Seldom. There's a loser and a winner. And particularly when the majority of people is involved, you can't push them into surrender dialogues. You've got to find a space and slowly work on a space with them that there can be a dignified dialogue. And again, if I may, one of the things that if I interpret Archbishop Tutu well and President Mandela with Ubuntu was, you can't push someone that is lying on the ground with a boot on their chest and a rifle on their head and say dialogue. Because the one who's going to dialogue with them and have the rifle in their hand, the boot on their chest, only want what they want. You've got to create a position where that person can stand up and face them as an equal and not being afraid to be shot dead, and have a dialogue of dignity. And I think these things challenge all our mediation techniques and tools. It goes against our normative frameworks of what we get taught, because we are dialogue people, we are mediation people, we are interventionists very often, particularly when people get killed. So in situations like this, what do we do? Because it's doing nothing is not an option. That is, we can't be bystanders of massacres and genocide. We have to do something. But who guides that? And if we just guide it ourselves based on our own compulsions, I think we are as dangerous as those that are causing harm. That it's really important that our heart and our values synchronize with those that are suffering, but also those that are trying to find change in that process. And that's a humbling thing, because most of us as mediators are fairly strong-headed people. We are not easy people. We are very difficult, strong-headed people. You don't convince us easily, and when we are convinced, we are not easily get unconvinced. We hold on to things, maybe as long as preachers hold on to things, and that I think it is very difficult for us to, to question ourselves in these moments, or stand back when you are in the middle of something where you can easily be the mediator or the one who saves the situation, and your saving would just be temporary. Your saving would be till tomorrow, and it is a much deeper process. It is like, I would always compare it to, it is like giving antibiotics or putting people on a health program. It is do you help them more in holistic health? Obviously, certain things certain cancer might need immediate treatment, but how much antibiotics do we want to give when it's not the time for antibiotics, when it is time to really strengthen for the longer term? Particularly when if you look at many of the world's conflicts that we sit, whether it's the Tamil one in Sri Lanka, or the economic one in Nepal, or the ethnic one in Myanmar. The Myanmar one is 70 years old. You want to put more antibiotics on that? You're going to kill people further. You've got to, it needs much more action like that. That doesn't come out of our frameworks, and that's very often that our normative frameworks often is very exact opposite of where people's movements are, and that's, I think, both the elements of people's movements that can be very difficult, and how do one catch the essence of where that is, and you help that, and out of that re-look at systemic instruments of national dialogues or constitutional change processes or formal dialogue spaces or non-formal dialogue spaces. But it's always like, in that chaos, what do we look? It's another point of our diagnostic frameworks of, do we have enough diagnostic frameworks to look at what happens in the chaos of people's movements? We've had in the Middle East for 3 years reflections with the 11 Middle East countries that went through the Arab uprisings. Very fascinating reflections that they've had. And, and some of it, you get very upset because it doesn't fit well with you. But then, then you look at what happened to Yemen after so many years, or you look what happened in Egypt so many years, and you think back of what those people that started these people's movements said to you in those reflections, and they were right. We were wrong. They were right. And that is that's I think the journey of us as humans and as change catalysts of never to stop learning and never think we know, because I think I'm working with an older advisor who's a federalism expert and been working in Myanmar for many, many years. He's now 80, and I am so encouraged to see at the age of 80, he's still a student. He's still a student. I remember my father at the age of 90, 2 weeks before he died, he wrote a letter. And I saw the letter only when we packed up all his things. And I wish I saw the letter before he died. Because at 90, he still had questions of deep things in life. And that made me much more comfortable with where I was, of realizing, I'm not sure where we are in age, but I'm a few years, a few decades past the middle of 100. But and you wonder, when will you stop asking questions? Or when will you be comfortable in your frameworks of understanding? And I hope we never get comfortable within our frameworks of understanding, because that what drives us in our journey of change, and makes us not necessarily valuable in the hands of international agencies, but makes us meaningful and trustworthy companions in the lives of those that go through the change processes, and helping them reflect and finding ways forward. I think that's the probably for me, and in the end, the essence of where we are. And I think just lastly, I think people often say, why you should be neutral. I said, no, I'm never neutral. I cannot be neutral. When I'm in a situation, people know exactly where I stand on the atrocities that get committed, but that doesn't mean that I'm not reaching out to those that are committing the atrocities. But you're not colorless. You have a color. You're not, and that gets me back to the Indian old professor here in South Thailand. It says, I am unequivocally biased when it comes to human rights and human suffering and oppression and what goes wrong. But my job is, how do I manage that biasness and able to work with people? And I guess we only manage that by being in touch with our own spirituality, by being in touch with, I would say, spirituality and not religion, because I think with religion we sort of settled into the comfort zones of theology, and I don't think that the greater beings were the gave formation to religion. I think they seeded spiritual beings that connect to something bigger than themselves, and I think that's the journey of helping people walking that and connecting to that spirituality, or the moral imagination that brings together spirituality and our values and the political realities.
It's interesting, because why I needed you to talk about this is because the kind of work that you are doing, even in that kind of conflict, heart, soul, spirituality can and does play an important role. That is what was required to come out, which is very interesting.
Yeah, thank you.
So it was really nice talking to you. So, I mean, look, the conversation can obviously go on, and this is one of those topics which we should keep discussing this. Except what I thought was that with the last symposium also, I've tried to keep them shorter, because sometimes what happens is people see a long session and they say, okay, maybe I'll watch it later, and they don't watch it. So that's one reason. But otherwise, I think, I mean, if you want to, in a way, kind of conclude, there won't be any conclusions as such, never. But if you want to just conclude on to how you are looking at heart, soul, spirituality, and mediation, just a conclusion.
I think I've probably shared enough now.
You have.
And I think for
Essence
me,
of it, yeah.
what brings it together is in our search for hope every morning. I mean, the heart, soul, spirituality, and politics and mediation comes together of where we find hope every day. And very many days we don't find hope. But that's the biggest challenge of our day, of where do we find these lights of hope, whether it is soldiers that decide they don't want to fight or kill people anymore, or whether you have people that reach out across the divide or say things that you never expected them to say, or just, people that you think should be absolutely devastated come up with some of the most valuable lessons of human life that also inspire you, because I think as mediators we need inspiration as well, and our inspiration most often come from the people that we are working with and supporting, and as much as we can give to them, they give to us, and it is a joint journey. So thank you for this time, and really appreciate what you are doing and enjoying all these conversations that you capture in a very, very significant way. Thank you.
Thank you. Because I'm using the words that we normally use, like developing trust and confidence and all that. They all have a base in these aspects. There is, and like you said, vulnerabilities, and you said about the Nepal situation, is because there is that heart which is connecting at some level, and those things which then bring out a different aspect of people, which you otherwise you would never think that can happen. But it's just that these connections we should be able to, I mean, discuss them and highlight the importance of them, and not just certain words being used and these aspects to be set aside. No, these are important parts of it. So we'll keep doing that. So thank you, Hans. Very nice talking to you. And I mean, really, I really enjoyed this. I could have kept listening to it. We'll have another session. So I'll just
Okay.
drop the recording at the live stream.